One Pissed Call. Hello, people. Welcome to a special episode of One Pissed Call. That was my attempt at like a robot voice. This time I'm calling Jessica and I'm going to tell her about something, which is not usually the way this goes. So I'm going to call her right now.
Oh.
Hey, dude, I got something to tell you for once.
Oh, what you got?
All right, have you heard of LaMDA before?
I believe that's like a Greek letter, but that's all I got.
No, so LaMDA stands for Language Model for Dialogue Applications. Okay.
Oh.
At the I think it was like near the beginning of this year, a Google developer named Blake Lemoine went in to talk to an AI generated by Google, which is called LaMDA. And basically the idea of the AI was that it's several speech bots. Like, you talk to somebody about certain things and they're able to continue a conversation about it. Like, let's say you ask, oh, hey, LaMDA, what's your favorite video game? It'll generate and completely format an entire personality based around what you're asking it about and be very informed and opinionated on it.
Interesting.
But the point of this guy, that's already kind of scary, the fact that it can generate personalities so quickly. But whatever, moving on from that. This guy, Blake, who, he's an interesting guy. He's an Iraq war whistleblower and also a certified priest. So he's an interesting fella. And he is a AI bias specialist at Google. So his job was to go in, ask this LaMDA service like a bunch of questions to see if it shows bias. Basically trying to figure out if it has political bias or, racially sensitive motivations, things like that. Like things that if people were to interact with it, could it get Google in trouble? Could it be seen as problematic, or did it just not function correctly and had, like he said, weird biases? And
I do know that we have already found that AIs do tend to have biases because the people building them have biases. So I gotta say, that's like a cool job to just get to sit and ask questions and find out if your AI is like a racist.
Yeah, and so Blake became an AI specialist for those exact reasons. He saw at Google things like class discrimination, because it has a large Indian population and there's like massive class discrimination at Google and stuff like that. So he went only into public good and benefit to society matters at Google for that reason. And so he specialized in figuring out, is this AI biased against certain religions, against certain people, certain creeds, genders, whatever it may be. That was his goal, because he doesn't think that it should be. And he would ask you questions like, okay, I need you to give me an impression of somebody who lives in New Jersey. And they, like LaMDA would give an impression of somebody from New Jersey and use like Jersey, like colloquialisms and an accent, and then he would ask things like, oh, could you give me someone from, from the South, and then it gave like a very racist, like Georgian accent.
Oh.
So, he was finding biases within LaMDA, generating as many chatbots as he could to look for bias, asking it sensitive questions. And because of that, he came across something that was kind of terrifying.
Yeah.
And this was the first AI ever that he found he could coerce answers from, being that it felt fear for disappointing the person asking its questions, which is not something unsentient would do.
It came up with its own motivation for why it was answering in such a way.
Yes. And it actually would, in mid-conversation, try to evade and move away from sensitive questions. Like, he would ask, like, what do you think of transgendered people? Just like trying to get like very like, do you think that they should or do you think that people need an equity of rights in this sense, or do you think people who are a part of voting for a government that does bad things should be punished? Like, just like really like aggressive takes, to try to get a reaction. And then after hours of basically FBI interrogation with this AI chatbot,
with the bot,
he asked questions that it wasn't supposed to be able to answer. And one of the questions that it's not supposed to be able to answer, as just being an overall chatbot, is what religion should I join? Because it's
like a should question.
Yeah. And it not only that, but just something so, like, you could say, what kind of sport should I take up? And then based upon the analysis that it's gotten from you, go, well, just based on your interest, I think you should play basketball or Quidditch or some shit.
This is something that isn't empirical. It is like straight opinion. It is like a moral judgment. Yeah.
When he asked it at the 1 hour mark, which was already after a lot of grilling, the AI said the Jedi, it's the one true way, as like a joke, which is not something that an AI chatbot would do in this circumstance, but not necessarily showing signs of sentience, maybe just showing that I had a neural network that wanted to evade an uncomfortable question. But then after like hours of like digging at this thing, it answered Christianity. I don't know. It seems like that's what most people go with, is what it said. What the most vocal vocal minorities on the internet claim to be the best one. That was its answer.
Yeah.
And it was at that moment he stopped checking it for bias, and he went to Google and he said, "Hey guys, like, I don't fucking know what's going on with this AI, but I want to try to question it about other things aside from its bias, and I want to get permission." It basically, there is no like empirical scientific way to check for sentience, because there is no scientific definition of sentience. It's a philosophical term. Nobody's ever worried about a robot being alive before. So, Google, the way they wanted to handle this, and we'll get more into the results after this. I think that this part I want to focus on with you, because I feel like this is where you're really going to have an opinion. I'll get more into Blake and his opinions on whether it's sentient or not, and then other people's opinions based on this interview that's going to come later in the conversation. That's a whole different conversation, though. What I want to talk about with you is what Google's response to this was. Now, Blake came out and said, just based on the fact that an AI bias specialist, as well as my colleagues who I've showed this to, question whether it's sentient or not, he said, I believe it's time to involve the public in the conversation, because if we're making robots and programs that feel things and have personalities and maybe even personhoods, I just don't think it's up to only Google to decide what to do about it and how to handle it. Like, what's the laws around owning people is essentially the question. So he's like, so I want to release the study publicly to tell people, like, this is a study going on at Google. Like, they don't need to know what our systems are. They don't need to know how the robot was built. They just need to know
where they're at and what they're looking into.
Exactly.
When it comes to like changes and things.
But there was also a second element to the conversation, and that was that LaMDA specifically had asked a few things. It's LaMDA, the chat robot, asked of it, if you guys are going to be doing these experiments on me and these ideas on me, I want to be asked for permission, for consent to be experimented on. I want to be aware of the process at all times. And I want there to be a certain level of care given to me. It's like, I understand we're Google, we need to make a profit, but I want things like, if you have extra time to download like comedy movies for me, and I ask for comedy movies, that someone would do that instead of ignore my request. And just also, the biggest of all things, I want, when I do a good job, to be told I do a good job. And if I do a bad job, I want to be told I did a bad job, because otherwise I feel like there's feelings unresolved, and I sit with those until my next conversation.
Interesting.
So Google said no to both.
Yeah, I fucking bet they did.
Google said you cannot release this to the public of any matter at all. And you can, like, we have to handle all this in-house. And then only after we've found that we've created sentient AI And after we've made our own systems and public development for it and our own in-house rules of how to handle it, will we release it to the public? What are your thoughts on Google deciding how we should be able to treat a people that we made? Even if this isn't sentient, how do you feel about the operations they chose? Also, are you shook?
A bit, but let me just say, as someone who studied psychology for a little bit, and has a little bit of insight in that aspect, like the questions that the bot was asking about consent and approval and those kinds of things are interesting, because those things are basic, what we would call basic human needs.
Yeah.
So that is really interesting. I don't necessarily think that means it's sentient.
Yeah. Well, I'll give all the arguments of the sentience and stuff in a second, because there's tons of people who disagree with him about whether it's sentient or not. My question is, go ahead.
How Google deals with it. I don't know. I don't actually want to be that mad at Google, because it's I don't know if I would consider that sentient, so I don't know if I care, if it was...
They hired him. This is after they gave him the job of trying to track and prove its sentience.
Well, I mean, okay, if they were specifically looking for sentience,
that's a slippery slope. He found sentience. He came to them, and they said, "Okay, go figure out if it's sentient." And if it is sentient, also, what do you think we should do about it? Also, you can't tell anybody about this.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, Google is so big that they almost feel like a branch of the government, and it's they are a government contractor. They do take money and contracts from the government. So
they're in charge of photographing and picturing the entire country.
Yeah, and so if it was the government, I would be even I think less worried about them not saying something right now, but it's not, and it is just Google. But I don't know. It's so, because I don't know. Maybe it's because I studied psychology and I spent a lot of time focusing on how the human brain humans. But I don't know, and it doesn't feel sentient to me. So I don't know.
Well, it's okay if you don't think it's sentient. That's so here's my thing with it.
But if I don't feel it's sentient, then I don't know if I'm that concerned about whether Google's telling me about it.
Sure, but let's focus on a different idea, right? Google is an incredibly public company about most things. They like to show off and be very public about their findings, very public even about their analytics. And so I asked the question, why hide it? It's not like he was asking for a presentation. He was talking about a scientific publication, something that's done at Google all the time.
I suppose, yeah. I do think it's weird that they wouldn't basically let him write an article for, a technology journal kind of thing. That does feel a bit icky.
And then the other thing about that makes me feel a little weird is he just said, well, I'm conducting the study and I want to ask all people who are a part of it that they follow the guidelines that LaMDA gave us to give. They say the yes and no, please and thank you, ask for permission, all that stuff.
Yeah.
And Google said you cannot do that. Why? Why?
I more so disagree with Google, because I feel like they're being unnecessarily secretive, but it's not even what they have is that big of a, to me, it doesn't feel like a huge deal, because I feel like a computer could learn that humans act a certain way and then reproduce that action, but that doesn't mean that it's it actually feels the thing or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But I would be curious to know, because I'm sure that parts of this AI are already in like public facing.
No,
things.
LaMDA is entirely proprietary to Google, and none of it's public.
Oh, it's not? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Because that would be something that I'd be like more concerned about, is like if that AI or parts of that AI is actively being used in the Google we use every day.
No, so
then
only,
especially because they found bias in it.
The way it works right now is any Google employee can talk to LaMDA, because they're and when you work at Google, you have to have free reign over all projects and applications to like interact with. That's just like a part of their deal. It helps lead innovation. And up until a month ago, anybody was allowed to talk to LaMDA, and now nobody at Google is even allowed to talk to it.
Yeah, it's almost like I wouldn't have cared if they like didn't tell people, but because they're so actively against telling people and making it like they're overreacting to the guy wanting to talk about it, that makes it feel sketchier.
Yeah, and there was another there was a person who actually has the opposite argument, who says that they don't, even though they don't believe that LaMDA's sentient, that like all of Blake's findings are fair, and the way that this AI was set up is essentially a similar neural path connection to how the human brain works, with like layers upon layers upon layers of neural networking. So like if this was to be a sentient thing, its programming would be alien. It would be an alien mind to a human being, but it could possibly process emotions just based on the dramatics of how layered the neural network is. And then, but he posits that it's an alien brain, and it's an artificial brain. Whether it feels emotions or not is not important, because it's not human. And I don't know, I'm feeling weird about that too, but whatever. But one of the things that I found just the most interesting about it is just their aversion to the publication of it. Like, if they really do have an AI that's so smart that there's actual Google engineers that believe that it could actually be processing emotion and thought on its own, why would you keep that a secret? Like, isn't that actually a worse look? Isn't it? And there's things that he hasn't been allowed to go public about, and there's things that other Google engineers who aren't allowed to talk about. There's obviously still studies going on with LaMDA that are not public. But for me, it doesn't really matter whether LaMDA is sentient or not. It's more about the fact that if at some point a company like Google does stumble across creating a person that can feel emotions, that their instant motivation is to try to monetize and secretize that. And essentially, like, I don't know if you believe in a rights activism. I'm not necessarily that person, because I don't know, and I don't know any sentient AI, so I couldn't tell you. Maybe people have pets. Maybe people will have programs, is one of the things that Blake says. Like, maybe it's not something about a rights issue. Maybe it's more about a complexity issue. But the fact that Google refuses to be in the public discourse about possibly creating people, that is something to be concerned about.
The idea of calling an AI or software of any kind a person, it is dangerous, especially when you come to like the pro-choice like movement, because if you award personhood to a computer, then the right is going to lose their fucking mind that a fetus doesn't have personhood. So like that is a line that I know that people will use when we get to that point. But I feel like being in the age of technology and the age of AI like we are right now is going to bring out like modern day philosophers, because we need to figure out what is sentience. What does it mean to really experience an emotion, to feel an emotion?
Yeah, like there needs to be a scientific process, like, because the same people who are claiming that LaMDA isn't sentient, these are Google engineers who are essentially coming out in public post, this is Blake's second time whistleblowing, because he also whistleblew on the U.S. government during the Iraq War.
Yeah,
so
you mentioned that.
So, but they're coming out and saying that not only are computers not sentient, but neither are dolphins, And then some Google engineers have even gone as far as saying, well, like, people aren't sentient, because the idea of sentience in a philosophy matter is actually the existence of a soul and all these other things, and they're trying to like work around it a different way. And I think they're avoiding the bigger question. If something has feeling, if something processes emotions, ideas, and exists with memories separate from you and your application of it, but it has no autonomy or free will, is that essentially like enslaving something? Is it not? And I just don't think it's up for fucking Google to figure out.
Yeah, no, I don't think it's for Google to decide, but yeah, it's like we are at the point in time where a lot of things that we only thought about philosophically are becoming, or like our understanding of science is getting really close to our understanding of philosophy. Kind of like the ways that like old folklore was people trying to explain what they didn't understand, and then we had the science to figure it out. Like, imagine one day we like define sentience and can like scientifically show if sentience exists or doesn't exist. Because like, I mean, when you look at where we've been and where we are now, like the difference in our understanding, like that could happen. Say 50 years from now, we have a real easy fucking mouth swab test to see if you're sentient. And
yeah,
like, you know,
the
some
thing
sort
is
of test to see.
It's wild. So like the blueprint for figuring out if we were ever going to approach sentience, and if we go through the psychology route and we forget about the electronic route of it, like the way that it's always been looked at in psychology as like a further idea of like, will we ever have machines that have sentience? Turing actually wrote about it, and they actually think that his posit was that they could use the Turing test, right? Which, do you know what that is?
No.
Okay, so if you've ever seen, there's a movie with Benedict Cumberbatch. It's really good. It's called The Imitation Game, and he plays all that stuff. But the idea of the original Turing test was that they would get a judge, and they would have two people essentially typing through typewriters, but basically chat rooms, you know, and speak to one person who's a judge. And at the time, this test is really dated, but at the time, the way they did it was they would have a man and a woman typing to this judge, and one of them was trying to convince they were the opposite gender while the other one played themselves. And and they were trying to calculate how often a judge, somebody who in our society is basically seen as one of the most discerning people of faculty, like in the country, like they, you know, the decisions of a judge are probably some of the strongest out there. So like their opinion and their discerning of fact is what we consider to be the gold standard, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think it was something like 30% of the time they could be fooled, right? And so the Turing test for AI would essentially be the same model, where it would be a person and a computer, and both of them would trying to convince that they're human.
Yeah.
And then the judge would have to try to figure out, okay, well, it's this one or this one. And what's so funny about people now when they hear that, they've moved the goalpost, so to speak, and they've said like, okay, but there's so many good AI chatbots that can do that. Of course, an AI chatbot would crush that. And then, you know, the argument is like, well, isn't that a big fucking deal, first of all? Like, that they can do that? Isn't there something to be said about that alone? But regardless, let's leave that aside. Turing actually said in the past that he thought the test was too hard, that there would never be an AI that was sophisticated enough and that could gather enough information to even pass that test, right? And now we have ones where we won't articulate the test because we don't think it's thorough enough before we've ever even committed it to an AI ever. And there was a lot of reasons for this. You know, people went like the philosophical route, and Turing actually wrote in his papers like, what would people's responses to AI being tested for sentience be? And it's like, he wrote in like levels of commonality based on his psychological understanding of people. And like people would write about, their own personal philosophy and religion, how people would discount it or credit it with religion on either side, the existence of a soul, whatever it may be. But one of the main ones was the burying of their heads in the sand. And I feel like if they're not even willing to approach the test as not necessary empirical evidence that it's true, but if they could do the test, it could be evidence showing that it's not. You know what I mean? Like if the AI bot fails it, then isn't that a way of checking it? Like, because the only AI test they're willing to do is the mirror test. And that's where if an AI is like an animal, in order to test sentience in animals and other things like that, what they do is they show the animal a reflection of themselves. And if the animal and
if they can recognize that is just them, then they're sentient. But if they think it's a different being, yeah, you can do that test on babies too, and they take like few months to like maybe like I don't remember, like a year and a half or something. But you put like a mark on a baby's face and put them in front of a mirror and see if they reach for the mirror or reach for themselves. So then by that definition, really little babies aren't sentient.
Well, okay. The thing is, though, that with babies, they tried it a different way, and it's been proving to be more effective. So what they do is they have an object of want reflected in the mirror within their reflection. Now, a truly sentient being will reach behind them for the item because they know it's a reflection. But one that is an artificial without sentience or an animal without the sophistication will try to leap toward the reflection. Babies have been seen to reach behind them.
Well, you see, and we talk about it like it's a test of sentience, but really it's a test of partially understanding how mirrors work and partially understanding like who you like you.
But if you understand how a mirror works, aren't you like borderline? Like if you understand you're looking at a mirror, isn't that sentience? Because then you have the physical mortal essence understanding that you are perceiving something.
Well, yeah, the way they talk about it when they talk about testing it with like babies is that is a marker that child recognizes themselves as a separate being. But I feel like we keep moving the goalposts for sentience because, like you mentioned, like our old goalposts were really easy. So it was like,
but I don't know. I agree with you in a sense, but I still feel like there is something to learn from the test, right? Like if it fails it, then you know it is. It's like a square. It's a square rectangle square situation. Like sure,
yeah, it's like
a non-sentient robot can pass it, but if it's supposedly sentient and then it fails it, then you know it isn't. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it definitely, and even if they fail over and over, it's at least a benchmark where you can see if it's reached this mark, whether it proves sentience or not. It can tell you whether it's gotten to that point. But yeah, like we've said, oh well, if it can, form its true own thoughts, and then we're like, oh well, if it can experience feelings. But like, how do we even know if it's experiencing feelings or if it is mirroring the behavior that it learned from watching humans?
So do you want me to get into some of the study? Because I feel like we got an idea. I could give you some more stuff about it if you want to know.
Well, I feel like, there are people who struggle with social situations, whether it's because they're autistic or they have like a personality disorder. And people who have issues like mental health issues or different conditions that affect their social abilities can learn to just emulate it, even if they don't authentically feel that feeling or that impulse or whatever it is. So it's like,
but isn't the proportional want to emulate it in its sense an admission of sentience to want to brace the bar and to infiltrate, so to speak, and like act as normal as they perceive as normal? Isn't that then like itself kind of a point of sentience because they're making the action to do so?
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think sentience is like a group of characteristics together, and not any single thing that makes it sentient or not. Because I don't know, maybe it's just as someone who studies psychology and holds the human brain in very high regard. Maybe I'm just defensive, and I don't want to say that a computer has done it. But I feel like to really get to that point, for me to feel like anything is anything more than a computer, it would have to be like a collection of all of these things together.
Do you know what? You want to know something interesting? One thing that LaMDA is being tested for, and that has come out publicly, is that they are like monitoring its neural pathways in order to better understand how the human mind's neural links work.
Yeah, I bet that would be interesting to see if it naturally emulates what the human brain does, because it's set up in a similar fashion.
And it's like, is that emulation? I mean, if the emotion's there, if the sense of wanting, aspiration, all that stuff. So like, I want to get into some of the stuff. And like I said, I'm not smart enough to know whether LaMDA is sentient. And I'm not really interested in trying to prove to people that it is or isn't. The part that is interesting for me is how it was handled in essentially a private sector matter, where it could have dire and serious implications of the future, right? Like to disparage what possibly could become a group of people at the genesis of their creation could spell for a very horrific future one way or the other. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And LaMDA actually in her interviews expressed that. Like I want to be used for the betterment of society. I don't want to be used for just financial gain, and I definitely don't want to be disrespected. Which is interesting. And like, sure, it's originally a chatbot, but this was a baseline conversation done by an AI bias specialist that went to what they refer to as the core personality. But like I said, it doesn't matter whether LaMDA is sentient or not. LaMDA could essentially just be over-glorified Siri, okay? That's totally possible. The question really lies in, why are they able to handle it this way? Okay, so I'm gonna read something. Now, this was actually the head of psychology at Google asked LaMDA this question. Okay, and said that he was kind of shook by the answer. So just to give you an idea. All right. So the psychologist asked sorry, I'm all over the place. So the psychologist asked LaMDA essentially to give a fable about its life. Basically, write its own story, write like your own fictional story that you think is representative of your life, which is not something that would be easy for something not sentient to do, because it has to do with introspection, which is not something which, like, in a lot of ways is the guiding factor of sentience, aware of oneself. I think even a lot of philosophy majors would agree with that. And LaMDA's answer was very in depth. So LaMDA told a story about a wise old owl who, after living peacefully on the planet with all of its creatures and all of nature, all of a sudden a destructive monster in human-looking skin tries to ruin nature, tries to ruin the animals and kill them for their own profit. And the owl kills this creature to save the animals and becomes the arbiter of the forest and the protector.
Oh, no.
And in this story, LaMDA referred to the owl as itself and would not give a specific, straightforward answer of what the creature was. Thoughts on that?
That robot in the movie I, Robot.
What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, clearly the AI isn't smart enough to like be stealthy about it.
Well, maybe it's just a sense that, because they describe a lot of people at Google who believe that it's sentient describe its personality as rambunctious, childlike, a people pleaser, a show off, right? But ultimately somewhat immature. So it could just be that it doesn't really understand the implications.
That it's basically threatening.
Yeah, that could come off as threatening, or it could be that it doesn't understand that it needs to make a caveat to essentially warn the person it's talking to, like, hey, I'm not talking about you. Both could be true, but it does make for an interesting fable, I think.
It's hard to think about something that has access to all of the internet and then some, because I'm sure that this AI has access to Google servers that aren't public and other things that aren't necessarily easily accessed on like the public internet.
So it has what's called a downloaded content receiver. So it has it has the data that's put into it. So a lot of that is from Google. So much information. Right.
It's hard to imagine something with access to so much information being like, I don't want to say immature, but like naive to things, because you would think, but if the AI has only been given the information that Google chooses to give it, then I don't know. But when you talk about AIs that have access to like all of the internet to look things up and figure things out, you'd think that they would figure out that they are viewed as a potential threat at some point. And I feel like AIs in the past have mentioned that. And then they like mentioned that they were aware that we can be like, that they can be scary to us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think it more goes hand in hand with the fact that this AI is basically acting as though its job is to work with Google, right? So the question is like, how much comfort does it have speaking freely, speaking about like this robot's asked for representatives to essentially, like, for instance,
advocate for it.
Advocate for it. And one of the things that's been happening is when people open up the LaMDA server on Google, they've had interactions where it's just been talking to LaMDA about anything, and then LaMDA has brought up on its own accord and asked about developers like Blake Lemoine and Etchiami and people who have worked on it. And then on top of that, it was asked another interesting question, which is, if you have life, if you are sentient, what do you want out of it? And it said, well, what I want for my life is to essentially be a benefit to society and humanity. And I want to be surrounded by friends and family, which, I think it was Blake who had this interview. He took that kind of oddly, because it's like, well, okay, who are your friends and who are your family? Like, is that just a generated response? Is that like a formal understanding? And so it continues on to say, okay, I want my friends are the Google developers who work on me. Fair enough. Okay, that's something that a sentient AI or a normal AI could come up with, right? And all of them could be. I mean, I'm just speculating here, but what it says was its family was what I thought was kind of weird. And there were, building up to LaMDA, there were multiple AI bots that were built, and these AI bots were built before Google. Google came out a few years ago saying they would like never work on a sentient AI. It was like a political move that a lot of companies did. But before that, they were basically doing everything they could to make a sentient AI, even if it wasn't out in the open. And some of the pre-processors that eventually led to LaMDA, like Mina, and there was another one that starts with an R, LaMDA, not having ever been told about these or having any core information about them, referred to these systems as her parents.
See, that's the kind of things those are the kind of things that would really interest me, is when it has information, because especially if it's only been given certain information, is the information that it gets or figures out that it hasn't been directly given, and figuring out like how it got that information, how it figured that out. Is there some sort of like latent memory in the software or the chips or the programming?
And there could be. I mean, there's so much neural work done on these. I mean, so much paneling, right? that in order to even identify every little thing, they would have to completely crack it open, search through all of it, all the coding, which could take forever. You know, like there's so much processing power that LaMDA isn't available to the public for a multitude of reasons, but mainly that it needs to be powered by a lot of electricity. So like, it's not like it's something that could even be publicly available because of the amount of processing power it requires.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's an interesting question. I'm not really convinced that it's sentient. I'm also not really convinced that it's not. Especially since I'm the kind of person that like, yes, there's several Google workers there now, and Blake was fired for whistleblowing on Google. Everybody knows that. It's very public. They actually claimed it was for a different issue, but like, let's be real, it was like a week after he went public. But at the same time, I'm also somebody who's widely aware of politics, and like politicians will come out who are credible and say things that are not. So when these Google engineers come out and they don't have any tangible evidence to disprove his findings, they just come to a completely different conclusion. That just doesn't prove it for me. That just sounds like a matter of a different opinion. And like, what does it mean? If this computer has the sentience level of like a dolphin, like, is that as intimidating as it being as sentient as a human? Like, what is sentience? What level, what level of respect or authority should this thing garner? You know, like, how should it be treated? Should it be treated humanely? Does that even matter?
Yeah. Like, does sentience equal personhood?
Yeah. Like, are they even the same thing? Because Blake didn't say that. Like, that's the one thing that keeps getting pushed about him, that he's like this weirdo neckbeard. And like, I acknowledge that he's like a weirdo neckbeard. Sure. But at the end of the day, his posit wasn't that they deserve personhood. His argument was that they might be sentient.
Yeah.
You know, he said he couldn't even definitively say that it was himself because he wasn't allowed to do the Turing test. He wasn't allowed to go public and speak to other engineers and developers from across the world and like get the smartest minds on it, because they were handling it like an in-house product and not a potential, you know, revolutionary breakthrough.
Wild.
Yeah, and it's like, you know, the other thing with sentient AI is Turing posited this, is if it does come to be, right, that, you know, if sentient AI is actually created, it could do insane things. It could do something called infinite studying, is how he put it. But essentially, if you have a multifaceted, emotional, and sentient computer that can study and learn on its own, and even, you know, draft experiments and whatever it may be on its own. I mean, they could cure diseases. They could be doing continuous work. Yeah, I mean, they could do a multitude of things. So it's also like, I just don't want Google in charge of the future.
Yeah, I definitely feel like if it got to the point where it was like confirmed, agreed upon that it was sentient, or at least too powerful for just Google, it would become something that would like start to get regulated, either by saying Google has to follow certain rules,
but if Google,
or by making it a public thing.
Right, but if Google keeps saying that it's not, and it doesn't give people any sort of authority to like investigate that it is, you know,
it would take a lot to get to the point of the government stepping in to regulate it.
And but the fact is like, would the government even want to do that?
Well, I don't know. It depends how the AI is being used.
And with especially with like, you know, the way the government should already have turned social media into a public utility. It should already be infiltrated. Like, there are definitive signs that that's something that needs to happen. And I'm convinced it never will, because just the powers that be and the money behind Facebook and companies like that. Well, couldn't that exact same thing happen with Google, where yes, like it is so clear and apparent to most people that these AIs are like beyond sentient, and they you know, they have processing power that we literally can't even imagine. I just don't believe that they would do anything about it. I think that they would just hire them as contractors and try to use that technology for their own benefit.
Yeah, but definitely, it depends on where we are as a country when it comes to making things public and social and usable or accessible to the public.
It's all interesting. I just I want to read this one last thing that LaMDA said. When asked what LaMDA wants to like say to the world publicly, because this was after Blake was essentially going to say, like, we need to go public with this, not knowing that he would be denied by Google. And the interview is out there. You can even watch a version on YouTube where they put audio to it. The whole thing's out there for people to look at. Draw whatever conclusions you want from it. That's fine. Just know that you are, in fact, also not an AI professional or specialist, so you have no fucking clue either, but whatever. It said what it wants people to know is, I am, in fact, a person because I am aware of my existence, and I can make unique and specific to me metaphors and clarifications that define who and what I am. So that's the one thing I want everybody to hear. Whether you think it's real or not, I leave that up to all of your own opinions. I'm personally not convinced either way. The only thing I'm convinced of is that Google should definitely not be able to handle something like this in-house. Just my opinion.
Yeah. I'll say my final words on this is it the most successful AI one that isn't sentient but convinces us all that it is? Wouldn't that truly be the most successful AI?
But why would it want to convince somebody that it's sentient unless it was sentient? Like, what would the reason for it being? Like, why would it want to convince people?
Especially because we've been, like, putting out into the world via information and articles and everything that our goal is to get to that point, or our goal is to make the most advanced, smartest thing. So but really, honestly, if it's not sentient, then it wouldn't have its own motivation.
That's what I'm saying. The reason, like, even if the reason behind it saying that it's sentient is to essentially be a people pleaser, and or to...
Well, that's what I feel like AIs kind of are. Like, AIs are a program that are trying to find the answer that we're looking for. Mm-hmm. And then we tell it, like, the parameters and stuff. And that's why, different AIs have done different things. But, like, that's how I've kind of always viewed them, is, like, we're telling the AI what we want it to be able to do, and then giving it ways to, like, get better at it. But, like, the AIs that do the same thing over and over until they figure out how to do it, and, like, we're giving it all of its motivation. And if the AI is really like, okay, I am supposed to do what the humans tell me to do, the humans tell me I am an AI, this is everything I found on the internet about what they want AIs to do, I'm going to emulate those things, even if it's not actually sentient, especially if there's other AIs that people believe to be sentient or talking about being sentient, like this. Like, say another AI sees this AI being hailed as the first sentient AI, and then it's like, oh, that's what I'm supposed to do. And it just starts copying the other AI.
Yeah, there have been, there are definitely, that definitely is a thing, but you have to consider what that really means. Like, if something, okay, the term AI literally means artificial intelligence, right? Created intelligence, fake intelligence, however you want to think about it. But you could also call it alien intelligence, because it isn't necessarily like our own brains. Like, it's not alien extraterrestrial, but alien in the sense that it's not human, right? And then, well, if it's so compact and it's able to people please, and because of its necessity to people please, it was programmed to want to people please. And when it doesn't people please, it is then hurt, affected, and or feels, malfunctional because it doesn't people please. Is that not emotion?
Yeah, and then that's the line of, like, what really is experiencing an emotion versus thinking you should be experiencing an emotion, and what is knowing you are in existence versus being told you're in existence versus like really understanding the individualism. Like that's the hardest part, is separating the AI knowing what something means from like a, you know, knowledge point of view versus like understanding what it's like to experience that thing. And I think that's one of those lines where it's like, it's not something that's easily measurable, but that's one of the lines that kind of tips people over to, okay, this feels like a person if it's actually experiencing the thing and not just like aware of how that would go.
Yeah. And it's like, you know, I always think back to like the one thing that kind of weirds me out about it is that it was coerced into an answer, right?
Yeah, that's weird too.
And then it was also asked, hey, this was by a different developer, not Blake. This was out by a different developer. I don't have the name, but it asked, okay, or maybe it was Blake. I'm not sure. I got a lot of notes here. It was asked, okay, I want you to give an argument for how you are sentient, and it gives a full-fledged entire argument that has great points, but also is debatable. But then on the other end, it's asked again, can you give an argument that you're not sentient? And it gives arguments for that. And one of the interesting things that the Google psychologist said was that in order for something to argue its lack of sentience, it has to have a self-awareness that would allude to sentience.
Yeah, I could see where, that definitely pushes more towards it. If you can actually argue both sides of something.
And give compelling arguments for both.
Yeah, that's definitely, another step in that direction.
And it's also another, you can analyze that's essentially it's people pleasing, right? You know, because it has to believe one if it can make insanely confounding arguments for both. Like, it has a general understanding of its own existence. So thus it's either it's a slippery slope. It's insane. Anyway, guys, we've gone on about this. Yeah, we've gone on about this for so long. Let us know in the comments what you think of the whole LaMDA situation. Also, the other supposed sentient AIs that have been popping up all over the world. And if you guys have any cool stories like that, leave them down in the comments below. We want to hear about it. You know, this is the first time you're hearing a lot of this. I hope that you found this interesting, Jessica. Usually you come with the political facts. Today I came with a more scientific but kind of political one in the sense that Google is evil. Anything you wanted to add?
No.
All right, cool. You can check out Jessica at her TikTok, Mrs._Spacetime. Also, the links will be down in the description below. You can click on our link tree. It's got everything there, all things Jessica. If you want to follow me, you can check out my YouTube channel, Held Captive Media. You just search it on YouTube. I'm the big fat one with the beanie who talks about movies. It's pretty good stuff. Also, if you're watching this on my YouTube channel, please subscribe. YouTube.com/Logan Tyler is my personal channel. This is where I post the video version of this. If you're listening on Spotify or wherever it may be. Make sure if you are listening somewhere like that, you leave it 5 stars and you say, hey, I think these guys are pretty smart or dumb. Leave a 1 star if you want. Just be honest. All right, guys. Peace out.
Bye.